So thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. Today's topic, as you know, is about partnering in China. And for those of you who haven't attended the previous webinars, we're going to do something a little bit different for this webinar. Instead of just talking about the biggest misperceptions, greatest challenges, common mistakes, and killer tips, we're going to actually go through a real case study. And hopefully, by going through the case study and understanding the progression of how partners in China evolve in their relationship with you, it can help you in your strategy when you are negotiating a partnership with your future partners in China. Okay, so for those of you who are attending the webinar for the very first time, we always talk about Guanxi as the most important aspect of doing business in China. And we call it a Guanxi engine. We're not going to go through it in this webinar, but you can always go back and watch the first webinar where we talked about a mindset for China business. And we really talked about cross-cultural performance mastery, which ties everything together as far as how do we as leaders and individuals improve our level of success in China. One of the things that we emphasize, so this is not just kind of cultural advice, teaching you how to exchange business cards, teaching you how to bow or shake hands. This is really about developing essential soft skills that matter when you are trying to do business in China. So the essential soft skills are basically awareness, self-awareness, cultural awareness, and empathy, your ability to understand what other people value and what other people think. So again, this is all covered in the first webinar, so I'm not going to go through it, but it all ties into our concept of what we call cross-cultural performance. And basically, in the framework of cross-cultural performance, the outcomes that we want to achieve can be influenced by the things that we adjust. And that would be our own attitude, mindset, and approach. And these adjustments are 100% controllable, and they will influence or affect how other people perceive you. And this is especially important in China, where you don't know how you are perceived. And it's only through developing the essential soft skills, where you can see the arrow pointing up to adjust, that you actually know what adjustments to make. Okay, so again, this is all covered in the first webinar. Today, we're going to talk about partnering. And whenever I talk to anybody for the first time when they're going to China and they're looking for local partners, or they have local partners, but they're not really performing the way that they want, or even in a really bad scenario where your partner has already started to do what you think are corrupt and unethical things, the first question or the fundamental question you should always ask is, what is my purpose for finding a partner? And if you're really clear on what you need your partner to do, then that helps you discover who the right partner actually is. Okay, so this time, when we really talk about misperceptions, a lot of this gets repetitive because when you're doing negotiations, when you're doing communications, or whatever you're doing in China, a lot of your misperceptions are similar. So when you're partnering or you're aligning objectives, it's really similar. So what I want to break it down into today is I just want to talk about the categories or the areas where most Westerners or foreigners, or in my case, most Americans, have misperceptions when we go and we're doing business in China. And of course, when we talk about China, we're really talking about mainland China, because other parts of Asia and other parts of China, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, even in Singapore, there's a lot of Mandarin-speaking people. That's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about in mainland China. So the categories of things or areas where you have misperceptions is really about time. So the Western concept of time is more linear. It's more important. We have deadlines, we have schedules. So that would create a lot of misperceptions. Another one is money. time value of money and finance is all related. But as we see in geopolitics, where China has a 100-year plan, sometimes our level of patience, when we say our, as Westerners or foreigners in China, our level of patience causes us to miss some opportunities. Other misperceptions deal with values, which are different. So again, what do Chinese people value? Well, you would think Chinese people value money, but actually they value something more than that. They value their face. They value the giving and the receiving of face. They value the reciprocity in developing Guanxi relationships. And of course, money is just kind of the after effect of all of that. And of course, when you're doing business in China, what you're going to really discover is that your priorities are misaligned. So when you think something is important, that actually could be a misperception about what actually somebody else thinks is important. Okay, so when we get into the greatest challenges, again, this time, instead of just getting to the greatest challenges of partnering, we're really going to go over that in the case study. But I want to talk about, again, categories of things that present the greatest challenges. So one is China is really a land of contradictions. And what do I mean by that? Is as a foreigner in China, what you perceive will generally be at opposite ends of a spectrum. So it'll be at one extreme or it'll be at another extreme. So at one extreme, you may think Chinese people are very conservative because of their culture. They don't like to speak up and have a difficult time getting their opinion. And then at the other extreme, depending on the situation, they seem very opinionated and they seem very determined to get what they want or to persuade you into their point of view. And it's basically how do you navigate in between these extremes? And the mindset is that China is a land of contradictions and you have to be prepared for that. The other challenge is obviously circular thinking or circular reasoning. A lot of Americans or a lot of foreigners, when they're in China and they're trying to communicate or they're trying to lead, they'll discover that Chinese tend to talk in a circular manner. It's almost illogical, their reasoning. And that's because their reasoning is more circular. And in circular reasoning, time almost doesn't have any significance. So in a personal relationship with somebody in China, anytime you might be in an argument or debate, they may bring something up that happened years or even decades ago and bring that up as a reason why they don't support what you're trying to do. So this is just indicative of very circular type of reasoning, which presents a challenge when doing business in China. Specifically with partnering, there's one thing that is challenging is something called quality fade. So any of you do work with manufacturers or suppliers in China, there was a book that was written in 2009. It's called Poorly Made in China, and it really discusses this phenomenon of quality fade. Now, quality fade doesn't happen as much in China anymore because the trend obviously is manufacturing excellence. So the trend in China is that manufacturing quality has been improving. It's been improving just because they've been doing it for so long, but it's also improving because of automation and more sophisticated quality systems, whatever you want to call it. But we want to talk about quality fade in the context of the mindset of individuals and why something like quality fade actually happens and how to prevent that in your strategic decision making. One of the things that I'm starting to talk about is something called goodwill extraction. And we talked about this at the last webinar. And basically, goodwill extraction basically means that when you're negotiating a deal with somebody, when you're in a partnership arrangement, there's two things that are going on. If you try to force too many concessions on the front end and quote unquote get the contract signed, Chinese will generally figure out how to get what they think is fair on the back end. And that's called goodwill extraction. Another thing that happens is if you don't pay attention to the system of reciprocity and the continuous need to further your Guanxi relationships with your partners, they will also extract value out of the value chain, which many foreigners will actually interpret as actually something corrupt. And you're going to see this in the case study that we're about to get into. Okay. So, again, we really want to get into a case study today, a real case study, to really kind of help you with um, imagining why certain things are happening with you in your partnership arrangements and how to prevent some things from happening in the future in your partnerships. Okay, so first I'm going to do a little quick disclaimer. So basically, what this disclaimer is, I'm not sharing any proprietary information, but I just want everybody to understand that imagination is really required. So we're going to try to talk about certain things, and we really want you to try to imagine why certain things might happen the way they happen. And empathy is required because what we want you to do is we don't want you to judge them immediately. So whenever somebody's presenting a case study where somebody in China does something corrupt or steals technology or cheats on something, then the immediate mindset that people get into is, you're just giving another example of corruption. But that's not what we're trying to do. What we want to try to do is we want to try to help you develop empathy for why Chinese people behave the way they behave. And then hopefully in your development of your business relationship with the people that you're working with, you'll understand how they're motivated, and you'll also understand better how to incentivize and work with him. So again, I don't want anybody to use this example to actually judge anybody in China. This is not what this is for. Okay. So the background of this case study is, okay, the industry is specialty chemicals. Specifically, it's synthetic lubricants, very high-end synthetic lubricants for automotive, for electronics, for industrial. So we're talking about, a pint of lubricant may be worth thousands of dollars. And for the application, when it goes into like electronics or connectors, it could be just very, very small amounts. So something this size could actually be enough for 10,000 pieces. But again, the lubricant itself is highly engineered. It has a very proprietary formulation, and it's very, very expensive. Okay, so the trend is obviously production has moved to China. So that is no longer a trend. In fact, the trend now is production is moving out of China into even lower cost Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam. Okay, but as production was moving to China, another thing that moved to China or is moving to China is research and development. And if you're in manufacturing or product development, a lot of the approval processes have also moved to China. Okay, so in this case study, the regions that we're talking about is basically Asia Pacific, Greater China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. If you want to add New Zealand and Australia in there, that's fine. The channels were basically exclusive representatives or distributors in different Asia Pacific countries. And some of the smaller markets like Thailand wouldn't even have a distributor. Okay, and the mission of this case study was to establish the China sales organization and sales channels to basically be able to do two things: to support product development engineers or R&D in China making design critical decisions, and also the distribution of these high-end synthetic lubricants. So because a lot of manufacturing go into China, one of the main goals obviously is to manage channel conflict. And what was unknown about the mission is how to avoid creating a competitor. And that's what we're really going to talk about in this case study. So before we really get into that, I just want you to kind of use your imagination. So if anybody kind of knows the history of China, there's a lot of animosity between China and Japan because of the history of war and invasion and colonization and all of that stuff. We're really not going to get into that, but we just want to use your imagination that your client is a Japanese automotive manufacturer, either Honda or Toyota or Mitsubishi, and they have a plant or a contract manufacturing services operations in China. Okay, so when you were working with the R&D or the design team in Japan that spec your product or your component or your lubricant, now it needs to be sourced in China. Okay, and then wherever it is, whether it's the Japanese plant in China or it's a Chinese contract manufacturer, the procurement specialist is Chinese. And then all of the sales representatives calling on that company are also Chinese. So if you look at this system that's been created between the Chinese people in procurement and sales, there's a lot of incentive to extract additional value out of this value chain because there's no reason we want to let or they want to let the Japanese kind of succeed or be more profitable. Okay, so this is just something that most Westerners fail to imagine when they try to understand what is the motivation for corruption and what motivates Chinese people to behave in a certain way. Okay, so in this case study, I'm going to talk about the partner that we found to help us do what we needed to do in China. So this is a fictitious name. Obviously, we're going to call him Jack. But his origins were very humble, very poor. So we thought that he would be very thankful and very eager if we gave him an opportunity. And we met Jack through kind of extended family of people that we were working with. This picture is not Jack, but when we met Jack, he literally could not afford shoes and he could not afford his train ticket to come meet with us. Okay, so the assumption would basically be that this would be very trustworthy, he would be very hardworking, and he would be kind of eternally grateful if we were kind of help lift him out of poverty, gave him a career, and help him accumulate wealth. And our approach really was to not only mentor him to start his own business, but to actually finance him to start his own business also. So we provided him training, housing, an office, and a warehouse. We financed his business registration because even today, usually it's much easier for Chinese nationals to register a business. So we registered a business in his name only, and we actually brought in inventory for him to sell. And basically for like US customers, let's just use automotive. So it's GM, it's Ford, it's kind of the first tier suppliers, Visteon and stuff like that. The orders that were designed and approved in the US and now being manufactured in China, we basically just gave him those orders. So all he had to do was take orders and to deliver product because it was already approved. It was all already approved. So that gave Jack immediate cash flow. And we spent a lot of time on joint customer calls to help him develop a local book of business, basically working with Chinese manufacturers and Chinese customers, and also to help him learn the technology and learn the engineering behind the products or the synthetic lubricants that he was trying to sell. Okay, so this is the background of Jack. And originally we had a distributor in Taiwan that was really covering mainland China. So that's how we started. We set up another distributor in the kind of the Shenzhen area. And as we were expanding, we wanted to set Jack up kind of in the Northwestern territory. Okay, so this is what we wanted to give to Jack. Now, what happened over time is what I call diverging priorities. Okay, so as a company, we were basically trying to establish and enforce the rules and the policies because we had Korean manufacturers and Korean distributors who had their production and their customers moved to China. We had the same in Japan. We had the same in Singapore. So one of the things that we needed to do really was manage channel conflict, and we needed people in China to kind of obey the rules. But Jack's priorities were developing Guanxi with all the connections and all the influencers around him. So uh, developing Guanxi relationships with us or with me personally was one of Jack's priorities because he thought or he needed my support to support whatever he thought he needed to do. But through this process, he was also developing relationships with people with the customers, the purchasing managers, even some of the engineers, as we went on these joint calls and we're doing these kind of technical presentations. And over time, there started to be goodwill extraction. Okay, so goodwill extraction number one. Okay, so what happened? Okay, so Jack started to siphon and recycle products through the supply chain. And so, what does that mean? So, we have inventory. So, these are the very expensive, it could be $20,000 a jug of some really high end synthetic lubricant. It would be sent into production. Okay, so they would kind of maybe use a drop or use a dip, or sometimes they would brush it depending on the connector or whatever. And then when it's empty, it would go into some type of disposal. Okay. Now, here's where the imagination comes in. So, how do you recycle products through the supply chain? Well, what happens if it goes into disposal before it's actually empty, right? You're talking about a jug of something. And if somebody says, okay, this one's done before it's actually empty, it can actually be sent into external repackaging, right? So you take about 5 or 6 of these partially used containers, and you can actually create one full jug or container of the exact same product. And that gets recycled to a different supplier. It goes through the same purchasing manager, and then it goes back into inventory. Okay, so this is how products get recycled, and everybody in this additional supply chain is extracting value or money from this situation. Okay, so this type of situation in China is incredibly common. Okay, but what we want to do is we want to understand why it happens and what we could have done to actually prevent it from happening. Okay, so our response at that time when we discovered that this was going on is we made the original distributor the master distributor to more tightly control inventory. So Jack could no longer place orders directly. He had to place orders through our master distributor, which was the Taiwanese distributor, and then through a better control of how much was needed and when it was needed, and Jack not being able to place orders at his own free will, we were able to kind of cut that kind of siphoning off. Okay, so then what happens? So then comes goodwill extraction number two. All right, so what did Jack do? Jack registered so we're an American company. Okay, so Jack registered all of our company trademarks in China. And he started telling customers that he was the only legitimate distributor for us in China. All right, so you can imagine what kind of a headache this created. I know a lot of companies, including Apple, face this type of situation in China where somebody registered their trademarks in China. And the way the China system works is the first person to register it basically owns it. And then you have to buy it back, or you have to fight it in court. And it's just really, really, it's just a lot of wasted time and wasted resources to do something like that. We were fortunate that we had some Guanxi relationships at the State Intellectual Property Office, so we knew of this registration shortly after it was filed, and we were able to contest it before it was actually granted. So that was something that we were able to kind of save off from actually happening. Now, this is goodwill extraction 3, and this is where a lot of companies who are bringing intellectual property or bring technologies to China, it's almost kind of a given that when you go to China and you transfer your technology, you could be creating your own competitor. Well, this is kind of something that we faced firsthand. So, what did Jack do? Jack started um, producing fake product labels. So, you can imagine if there's just grease or oils in here, even though they're very expensive, anybody on the production floor, anybody in purchasing or inventory control really doesn't know what's inside. They only look at the label to see what's inside. So Jack started producing fake labels and he started getting away with sales where he could. Okay. And he was selling obviously fake product with these fake labels. And we would have to go to all of the customers and warn them that if you don't use legitimate product, you're going to have quality issues down the road. But as Jack built up his business, he was also investing in his own products and his own production capabilities. And it basically just created a headache. So, from being so poor that he couldn't afford shoes and he couldn't even afford a train ticket, within 2 years, Jack had learned enough. He had developed enough Guanxi relationships with our customers, and he was capitalized enough to start competing directly. Okay, and this is a real thing. This happened to me uh, over the course of, I would say, almost just a year, where we were working with Jack, and he was basically telling us everything we wanted to hear. He was taking us on, finding new opportunities, and in the on the back end or behind our backs, he was setting up his own kind of competitor. So we know that a lot of companies have encountered this in China, but this is just a real case study of how it actually happened. So, what are the lessons learned? And what are the killer tips to try to avoid something like this? So, one lesson is having IP protection really doesn't do anything in China because enforcement of IP is extremely time consuming and extremely expensive. And if you're not Apple, then basically you won't have the resources to do that. And in our case, we thought we had something that could not be reverse engineered because it's a chemical formulation. So as long as we had the formulation, you could, even if you analyze the chemical composition, you could not replicate the performance of something if you didn't know the formulation of how to create it. But in China, sometimes that doesn't matter. They just create something that's close enough, similar texture, similar color, and then they sell it and it just goes into production. And sometimes it results in a warranty because something breaks down, but sometimes it doesn't. Okay. Another thing is foreigners really cannot fight Chinese nationals without great costs, energy, and resources. Okay. So it's just much better to just work with them from the beginning, continue to develop the right relationship and the right monitoring system. When you're looking for your partners in China, I think finding the right partner is much more important than finding a local partner. A lot of people go to China with the mindset that I need a local partner, and they forget that what you actually need is the right partner. And a lot of people say that, well, what is the right partner? Right partner is somebody that shares similar values as you and stuff like that. Well, you're not going to find a local partner that shares similar values if you're an American. What you need to do is you're going to find a partner that you have enough common interest with and chemistry with that you can cultivate the Guanxi relationship. Okay. And so when you're working with your partners, you really never stop developing Guanxi because, as we talked about in negotiations, for us, negotiations ends when the contract is signed. For Chinese people, negotiations begins after the contract is signed because they don't really care what's stated in the agreement. They basically, how I'm going to work with this partner or this customer or this supplier is basically what happens over the course of time. Are we able to develop closer Guanxi relationships? Okay. So this is a real case study of something that happened in China. And as I've highlighted all of the different ways that somebody that we basically trained and gave an opportunity to, but we didn't have enough people in China to continuously develop the relationship. We weren't empathetic to what Jack really wanted to do was, he wanted to develop his Guanxi relationships with more people. He cared more about his face or mianzi and not being able to do things that he wanted to do that his customers were requesting him to do because we were managing the entire region. A lot of times that may have pushed Jack towards doing or behaving the way that he actually behaved. Now, obviously, I'm not giving him an excuse for behaving that way, but what I am saying is that there are things that probably we could have done to prevent him from behaving that way. All right? So I'm going to end the formal presentation now. And those of you who are I'm going to unmute everybody. So Kenny, you can also unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically if anybody has any questions or comments, just go ahead and jump in and just ask whatever questions you want. I'm going to stop the share screen so you can just see me.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to open it up basically for questions.